So, thanks for sticking around to listen to my presentation on legal tools for the sharing economy. Um, but before I get started, I think I'm going to talk a little bit about what the sharing economy is and how I think an attorney who's interested in the sharing economy can be involved in it. But I think it's important to have a little bit of understanding of where this, I'm going to call it a worldview of the sharing economy comes from. And I think it largely stems from recent historical events, namely the 2008 financial crisis. I'm also going to identify the 2010 BP oil spill as another event that I think has spurred interest in this sharing economy. And I think those two events are significant because in both instances, you have large organizations or businesses that take actions that impact local communities that they are completely detached from and have no interest in. And I think that's maybe one reason that those things happen. So it's interesting. But the sharing economy, for me, is about creating a change from the way that things have occurred in the past and doing things differently so that we can create a sustainable economic and environmental climate for where we're living, and we can be happy and prosperous in our communities. And it's important for me that this shift from the way things were to the way I think things can be is something that's going to happen from the bottom up. It's going to be a grassroots movement where individuals are making choices about what is important to them, and communities are taking steps to improve their environmental and economic situations. In the sharing economy, I think communities and individuals are rethinking our perceptions of consumption, production, and exchange. And at this point, that's a bit all vague, but hopefully you don't entirely think that by the end of the presentation. So my name's Ryan Hamilton. Everyone in this room knows me. I'm an attorney at Fair Shake, and I'm interested in providing legal tools to build these sustainable communities. So I think a transactional law practice focused on, entity formation, contracting, et cetera, is one way to facilitate this sharing economy. Today, I will be giving you general legal advice, but if you have specific questions, you should consult an attorney. So, the first question that I think we would want to answer is, what is the sharing economy? And it's pretty challenging to define. Again, it's more of a kind of way of looking at the world rather than a easily definable thing. But I think we can also define it by telling you how it's different from what we have now. So, in the new sharing economy, I think the focus is going to be on building community ownership, on focusing on localized production, cooperation, small-scale enterprise, and all of these things are about keeping decision-making, power, and wealth within the community. And I think this is a way to make our communities sustainable places to live rather than places where large businesses or industries come in and provide jobs and support, which is great for a period of time until they leave. And they neglect that community because they don't have the attachments to that community that small-scale enterprise and community ownership generates. So before I go any further, I should mention that a lot of these ideas are from a book by Janelle Orsi called Practicing Law in the Sharing Economy. She's an attorney in California. She runs the Sustainable Economies Law Center, which is a nonprofit organization, but she also runs a for-profit law firm doing a lot of these sharing economy things. So here's a few examples of what I think, some more concrete examples of what the sharing economy might look like. So you've got co-housing communities, social enterprise, which is a hot buzzword now we'll talk about later, car sharing groups, time banks, renewable energy cooperatives, co-working spaces, which are pretty popular in Pittsburgh right now, And I think you'll notice the themes here are about sharing resources. It's about access to resources rather than ownership. It's about supporting economic enterprises that are operating within your neighborhood. So it's about using your wealth to support your neighbors rather than a company that's owned by someone who doesn't live anywhere near you. And I think there's really three components to this new sharing economy. Consumption, production, and exchange, I had mentioned before. And when it comes to consumption, I think our default right now tends to be that we need to buy and own everything. And I'll be the first to admit that it's challenging to think of a different way of doing things. But I think from an efficiency standpoint, it might make more sense if we have access to these things rather than needing to generate the resources that allow us to buy and own these things. So kind of like very average examples of this and typical right now are condominium buildings where you own a small space, but you partner with everyone else in your building to support that shared space that you have. You also think about organizations like Uber and Zipcar, which give you access to that personal vehicle, but you don't need to own a personal vehicle to be able to use it. And I think this is a way, something that the sharing economy, we're going to call it, is facilitating. The second thing I want to talk about, or the second component, is production. And currently, our default tends to be that we each have a job, we work at it full time. And that's a great thing, but a lot of people are fearful of losing those jobs. And they're fearful of losing those jobs because someone else decides that they can keep that job or they have to go. And that someone else might not have your local community's interests at the forefront of their mind. And their goal isn't to provide you with a sustainable livelihood as an individual. But in the sharing economy, I think we're going to see a shift away from relying on someone else to provide us with our work and income, and we're going to be focusing on supporting individuals who want to produce their own job, we'll call it, produce their own wealth and income, and provide themselves with the resources that they need to get along, survive, and be happy. So the third component is exchange. And this one's also pretty challenging to think about because right now we rely on dollars. And dollars are great because we can trade them, everyone accepts them, we know what it is, we know what the value is. But I think in the sharing economy, you're going to open the doors for new types of exchange mechanisms. When people don't have access to those dollars, I think they still have skills, they still have other resources, and the sharing economy is going to try to capitalize on those things. So we're thinking about, barter networks, time banks, even local currency systems where you're not necessarily required to have dollars to participate in that economy and provide yourself with the resources that you need. So when we think about transitioning to this new economy, today I want to talk about different tools that we can use to make that transition. But I think it really starts with building relationships, and those are going to be casual and spontaneous at first. I have a neighbor who I walk over to their door and say, hey, I don't have a saw, you do, let me borrow your saw. I think that's going to be casual and spontaneous, but when we want to scale these relationships and create reliable relationships that we know we can replicate and see it happening again, we're going to want to form more formalized agreements. We're also going to want to build organizations that aren't interested in necessarily only focused on producing profits, but and you'll see a lot of these organizations popping up already. They're focused on providing some kind of positive good along with producing profits. So today I'm going to talk about those two things simply. There's a lot of other things we could talk about in the sharing economy, but I'm only going to talk about agreements and organizations. So let's talk about that. I think there are going to be new kinds of agreements in the sharing economy. And like I said, I think personal relationships are going to drive those agreements. And here's a short list of the ways that, or the agreements that we might be forming in this new economy. So I think we're going to see an increase in co-ownership agreements. There's going to be a lot of different leases and licenses. So again, this doesn't mean you own something, but through a lease or a license, you have access to that resource. Borrow lend agreements, membership use agreements, etc. And I think agreements are important for setting the tone of that relationship, even when it becomes more formalized in a contract. They provide fallback rules for relationships that are otherwise managed casually. You can use agreements to communicate and keep track of information. And you can also use them to facilitate a well thought out and well communicated plan, or to avoid the application of legal default rules. So they can be really important. And whenever I'm thinking about drafting an agreement or reviewing an agreement, there's really 10 basic components that I think about in any agreement. And I think it's going to be important to think through how we address each of these 10 components in this new sharing economy. So I'll go through them quickly. But the first component is intent and vision. And I think it's really important in developing an agreement to lay out your purposes for the agreement. This doesn't necessarily mean it has legal ramifications, but I think it's important because it sets the tone for that relationship that your agreement formalizes. So I think if you can set a tone with that agreement that helps you to cooperatively manage that relationship, I think that's important and valuable. And yeah, like I said, in the sharing economy, I think these agreements are going to be collaborative and mutually beneficial. The second and third components are roles and promises, and this really lays out the heart of the agreement. These are the actions that are going to be governed by the agreement, and who needs to do what, when it needs to happen. Time and value goes along with that. How does compensation change hands? In the sharing economy, that compensation might not be dollars. It might be some other resource. It might be time. And agreements allow you to value those things and formalize that once casual relationship in a way that's legally enforceable and provides you with, I guess, structure and reliability, really. The fifth component is measurements of satisfaction. And this is your chance to spell out your expectations for that agreement. What's it going to mean when you walk away from that contract and you're happy, or what's going to happen when something goes wrong in that agreement and you need to take legal action to enforce it? How do we define satisfaction? The sixth component is concerns, risks, and fears. And I think people often try to avoid talking about the risks that an agreement presents, especially when they're in the process of building that relationship and things are going well. But I think this is something that you should not neglect to address. And you can do that in an agreement. Number 7, you've got renegotiation and dissolution. So what happens if our situation changes? Maybe we want to ensure that this agreement continues and moves forward, or maybe we want to have a way to get out of it if things go badly. Number 8, consequences. What happens when someone doesn't follow through? Number 9, conflict resolution. So the question is, how are we planning to fix this relationship if it goes wrong? Do we want to go straight to a court? Do we want to mediate or arbitrate? Do we want to require ourselves to try to work things out informally before incurring those kinds of legal costs? That's all something that you can build into an agreement, and thinking about it beforehand, before things go wrong, will often set the tone that allows you to try those things out before you need to take costly and lengthy legal action. Lastly, number 10, agreement. Check to know, are we both satisfied with this? Is this what we expected to get into? And does it accurately reflect how we want to move forward? So that's really all I'm going to talk about regarding agreements today. I just wanted to present it as a way to kind of formalize those those casual, spontaneous relationships that we have that are mutually beneficial, that we all feel good about walking away from. And I want to present legal agreements in the form of contracts as a way to formalize those relationships and provide structure and reliability and really scale up those kind of small interactions that we have. That's the dream anyway. So the second thing I want to talk about are new kinds of organizations. And it's interesting because organizations are really just agreements that are entered into by groups of people to govern how they're going to work together. And ideally, they're going to be structured to continue on as people join that group or leave that group. But it's really an agreement. And I think in this new sharing economy, I think organizations are going to start looking different. So right now, the kind of hot buzzword is social enterprise. And this is where for-profit organizations are operating in ways that not only focus on profits, but also focus on promoting some type of social good or benefiting their community. And I think we're also going to see an increase in community-owned or cooperative enterprises. I think that's going to be something that comes out of this as well. And these groups aren't going to necessarily be thinking about making the most money in the shortest amount of time. They're going to be thinking about their purpose, in fact, is going to be about creating rewarding livelihoods, providing for ourselves and our communities, regenerating our damaged ecosystems, and really nourishing our local economies. So it's exciting, but every organization needs to answer really three basic questions. And the first one is, what entity structure are we going to choose? This is a legal question. There are statutorily created legal entity structures established by the state. And most people think corporation, limited liability company, or a nonprofit 501c3. And these really serve a majority of our needs, but there are a lot of other entity structures out there that are possibly better suited for this new sharing economy. And today I'll talk about a couple of those as examples. The second question is, what tax status should we obtain? And this sort of goes along with entity choice, but it doesn't need to. So for instance, you can form a nonprofit organization, incorporate it as one, and not necessarily decide that you need to go obtain federal tax exemption for that nonprofit. So it's a separate question, but it goes along with it. And really the question is, what are the purposes of your organization, and how are you going to be financing that organization? So finally, the third question is how to structure that organization in terms of governance, operations, and finances. And it's interesting because there's a lot of flexibility in how this occurs, especially in an LLC structure, for instance. There's almost no limits on what you can do, whereas in a nonprofit entity structure, you're going to need to be governed by a board of directors, or in a corporation, you're going to need to be beholden to shareholders and directors, and you're going to have a host of other legal requirements to benefit from that entity structure. So today I'm really want to talk about several different types of organizations, kind of the untraditional ones that we don't always think about first. And the first one I want to talk about is a B corporation. And this is a little bit confusing because there's really two types of B corporations. There's a B corporation, and there's also a benefit corporation. And the first one, the B corporation, it is not a statutory business form. So it's not a legal entity or a legal structure that I was talking about. It's actually a certification similar to Fair Trade or LEED certified. And that certification is provided by a nonprofit organization called B Lab. So you essentially submit a questionnaire to them about your business practices related to the environment, public service, community support, treatment of employees, etc., and they'll certify you as a B Corp. It's actually really similar to the Sustainable Business Designation program that's happening here in Pittsburgh through Sustainable Pittsburgh. So it's pretty cool that they've sort of replicated a similar model that demonstrates that, hey, this organization is really just trying to take steps towards being more environmentally and socially responsible. But if you go through this B Corp designation, once you obtain the status, you're going to need to add specific B Corp language to your organizational documents. So these are the documents that you would file with the state. And this language is going to, in some ways, restrict how shareholders and directors or whoever's managing your organization is required to weigh decision making. So notably, even if you're not a certified B Corp, you could add this language to your organizational documents and operate that way anyway. Something to think about. So the second type of B Corp is the benefit corporation. And this is an actual statutory business form. And in 2013, Pennsylvania became the 12th state to recognize a benefit corporation as a legal entity. And a benefit corporation differs from a standard corporation because it's required to create a material positive impact on society and the environment. It's required to meet higher standards of accountability, and it must be transparent about reporting its overall social and environmental performance. And this is based on kind of independent third-party standards. So traditionally, a corporation's focus and the actual legal duty of the officers and directors of that corporation is on enhancing shareholder value. And they're legally required to do that to the exclusion of other factors that might weigh into their decision making, such as, is this good for the community? Is this good for my employees? There's actually, legal protections in place for that. So the benefit corporation is designed to reduce those requirements and allow a corporation to embrace that mission of societal good along with profits. So that's kind of interesting to know that that's out there. The second type of organizational structure that I'll talk about is the low-profit limited liability company. And this is an LLC with a charitable, educational, or positive social change central to its mission. And to understand why this L3C designation is important, you need to understand program-related investments. So, stick with me. Program-related investments. So generally, foundations, charitable foundations are required to distribute 5% of the value of their net assets for charitable purposes every year. And to meet this requirement, they generally just provide grants to charitable organizations. But they're also permitted under Internal Revenue Code to meet that 5% investment requirement by investing in for-profit entities if the investment meets a three-pronged test. So the test requires that the investment is for charitable or educational purposes, that the production of income is not a significant purpose of the investment, and that the purpose of the investment doesn't include attempting to influence legislation or take part in political campaigns. So if you meet these three standards, then it can be a program-related investment. But these types of investments are relatively uncommon because foundations aren't willing to risk the IRS coming in and determining, well, that investment didn't quite meet the three prongs, and that would open up the foundation to risk of tax liability or even losing their tax status. So the L3Cs were created in response to this program, and under the L3C statutes, these entities are required to contain language in their formation that ensures that they meet this three-pronged test. So that organization itself is going to meet that three-pronged test, and that gives foundations the reliability that they need to invest in that for-profit organization. So this is sort of interesting, but unavailable in Pennsylvania. So sorry to let you down. In 2014, there were only 8 states with these L3C statutes, and actually North Carolina was one of them, but just repealed their statute. So it doesn't seem like this entity structure is one that is catching on, but it's interesting that people have been thinking about how to get around those program-related investment requirements and really think about social enterprise in a new way. So that's the L3C. The third entity structure that I want to talk about is cooperatives. And generally, a cooperative is a type of business organization controlled and operated by a group of users or members for their own benefit. Basic definition. And cooperatives have been around for a long time. There's documented cooperatives as early as the 18th century. And I think these cooperatives are especially well suited for the sharing economy. Generally, the kind of cooperative principles are voluntary and open membership, democratic member control, member economic participation, meaning everyone contributes equally, autonomy and independence. They provide education, training, and information, and they have an increased concern for the community. So theoretically, any organization could adhere to these general principles. But in Pennsylvania, as in many states, we have an actual statutory entity structure that facilitates an organization doing this. And from a tax perspective, cooperatives incorporated under that statute get beneficial tax treatment. It also, in Pennsylvania, allows you to use the term cooperative in your organization's name, whereas otherwise you wouldn't be allowed to. And in Pennsylvania, you could be a for-profit or a not-for-profit cooperative. So there's that. Yeah, so it's interesting that the tax benefits that I mentioned aren't necessarily related to simply incorporating under that statutory structure, but it's whether you meet a standard of operating on a cooperative basis. And the leading case law defining what operating on a cooperative basis means is from 1965. It's a case Puget Sound Plywood versus Commissioner. It's a tax court case, and it says that operating on a cooperative basis means democratic control by members, so governed by members on a one-member, one-vote basis. Operation, the second thing that it means is operation at cost, meaning money left behind other than reasonable reserves is paid back to the members. And the third point is subordination of capital, meaning that returns to investors need to be limited. So that's not the primary focus of your cooperative. So that's generally cooperatives. And there are consumer cooperatives, producer cooperatives or marketing cooperatives, and also worker cooperatives, which are worker-owned. And I think that's a really empowering way to think about the sharing economy, because I think a worker-owned cooperative gives people who otherwise don't have a stake in that business or organization an opportunity to really invest in themselves and their own sustainable well-being. So I think that's something exciting that's out there, and I think going to increase in this new sharing economy. So the last entity structure that I want to talk to you about are nonprofits. And generally we think about charitable or educational organizations incorporated under Section 501c3. That's where that comes from. That's the statutory basis for this entity formation. But believe it or not, there's actually 28 different categories of federal tax-exempt organizations under that statute. And we mostly rely on the 501c3 exemption because it makes the organization eligible to receive tax-deductible donations, which isn't always the case in some of the other entity structures. So I'll talk about just a few of these very quickly. But one is a 501c4. This is a civic league or social welfare organization operating primarily to further the common good or general welfare of the community. But it doesn't have to meet the same stringent requirements as does a 501c3. The 501c5 works to better conditions of agricultural or horticulture. So these are often things like organizations that conduct soil tests on a cost basis for farmers. Maybe they raise livestock or they cultivate useful or ornamental plants. They might guard the purity of a specific species or breed. They can incorporate under this structure. The 501c6 is a business league or chamber of commerce, and their purpose is to promote the common business interests of a group of persons, but not to engage in business. 501c7 is a social, recreational, or other non-profitable business. And these are organizations formed to promote their own goods. So as an individual, I can go out and enjoy doing these things without worrying about taxes. And the theory behind this is a group of people should be able to get together and recreate and combine their resources in the same way and not have the same tax implications. A 501c12 is for benevolent life insurance associations, mutual ditch or irrigation companies, or mutual or cooperative telephone companies and like organizations. And like organizations have been found, qualifying like organizations are funeral cooperatives, cable television cooperatives, and energy services. So I think there's an open question of whether modern communications cooperatives could also fall under this entity structure. And I have a personal interest in renewable energy, so I think renewable energy cooperatives might find a home here. Lastly, but not least, Section 521 and 501c16 provide favorable treatment, but not complete tax exemption status for farmer cooperatives that meet certain requirements, including their primary activity must be to market the products of members or other producers, or to purchase supplies and other equipment. And they have to return profits to their cooperative patrons. So I think that's another way that we're going to see an increase in these types of organizations in the sharing economy. And I wanted to point out a couple different entity structures that you might not traditionally think about, but they're out there and available. And I think individuals and groups of people that are interested in growing and facilitating the sharing economy should be aware of these, think about them, and utilize them as a resource. So that's about all I have. Here are some further resources if you're interested in the sharing economy. There's some great books out there. That's it. Does anyone have any questions?